Good morning, grinders. Welcome to the DFS Pre-Game Show here on RotoGrinders. I'm Jordan Cooper, a.k.a. BlenderEd. BlenderHD if you want to follow me on Twitter. And it's Wednesday, November 16th. It's 2 days after we just found out DraftKings has changed their MMA product. Now there's late swap, right? You enjoyed it so much in NBA DFS, right? Especially when the start times are staggered every 15 and 30 minutes. Well, now you get that same experience on Saturday nights from 6 or 4 to midnight. So instead of going out and having a good time, and instead of sitting down with the beer and maybe your buddies and watching the fights, you're going to be sitting by your computer. So every 20 minutes, you could late swap your lineups to extract extra expected value in your contest. And when I heard about this change, I thought there was one person that was going to clean up in the lobby now, and that's Daniel Hutchings, nerdy tenor, the nerdiest of all tenors. Daniel, are you ready to grind your ass off on Saturday nights and run your simulations every 20 minutes in order to take down the most amount of money in these MMA contests?
Yeah, no, not really. I really have mixed feelings about this. On a pure game level, I find it really interesting because you've added a whole new dimension to the game that is MMA DFS, which is really interesting. Lots more strategic decisions. It completely ratchets up the percentage of your EV that comes from game theory and applying game theory to your process. So it's even more heavily on that than it already was.
So can we first talk about why that is? Because I think, obviously, if you're listening to this show, if you're watching the show, I don't think I have to explain it that much to you. That late swap in general, regardless of the sport, means that you have more information to make choices. Like the fact that, like in NBA, you could go, oh, is Jokic going to play? He's questionable in the late game for the Nuggets, or is Steph Curry, the Warriors, going to play? Well, you get to now make a decision when the news comes out 2 hours later and then change your lineups accordingly, as opposed to it just being locked at 7. And you just have to make a guess. You go, well, I'm going to act as if Steph is in, or I'm going to act as if Jokic is out. And then if I'm wrong, then my lineups aren't as good as they should have been. And if they're not, but understand that casual players primarily don't late swap and don't make those decisions unless a player in their lineup is injured. Of like, okay, right, I have Jokic in, and now he's out. Now I'm going to play whatever other center is available. DeAndre Ayton at that point. They view it as that. They remember the times they get a 0, but they don't realize that because you can make further decisions, same thing with 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock Eastern start times for NFL, that the more decisions that are put in front of you, the more ripe it is for skillful players to make money. The more betting rounds there are in poker, the more variance, the more you actually want more variance if you're a casual player, but this actually lessens the variance because you could swap out. But Daniel, I've heard arguments. Obviously, it's typical of the bad players. This is what makes it. The change is being applauded by the people that it affects negatively the most, right? And it's one of those weird things where they're like, well, now I don't have to worry about getting a 0, and what do I care? How does late swap affect me that much? I mean, I'm just going to try to pick 6 of the best winners anyway. Like, why would I ever swap off to someone that I don't think is going to win?
Well, I mean, it's pretty easy to see why this could happen in practice because, you imagine that you have a pretty chalky fighter and you're sort of even with the field on it, and he was 70% to win and he busts, right? So all of your lineups that have that player in a big GPP have no shot at first, right? But if you were building well, presumably a lot of your decision making was aimed at winning first, right? Well, now that's all out the window, right? Your lineup has 0 shot at first. But whereas before this was not interesting, now it's almost like you're playing a different game because maybe you only have a shot at 50th place, but your lineup has some pretty off the wall plays on it in an attempt to get first that now do not make any sense, because you're not getting first. Your equity is much further down the payout table. So it's almost like the field has been split in two and you're playing two different games in a big GPP. And if you're not considering these kinds of factors, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. The analogy with NBA is not perfect, because NBA, basketball players being out is routine. It's every night. And frequently it opens up huge value because the minutes of one player go to somebody else. So a player that was quite marginal can become almost mandatory because they're just, 7x, 8x value per dollar. In MMA, it's closer to NFL late swap, where if you're in a contest and after the morning games finish, you discover that your lineup is just crushing the field in the contest that you're in, it frequently makes sense to swap the rest of your lineup to chalk your pieces to block people from catching you who have those pieces. It's much more analogous to that, but it's much, much worse in the sense that in NBA or NFL, not counting injuries, if you're making swaps, you can get EV making swaps based on what's happened already, right? Just forgetting about the injury part. So you have more information, you know what all the lineups are, and you know what players have done. But there's usually so many choices in NBA and NFL that if you don't do that, it's probably not a gigantic mistake. But in MMA, it is a giant mistake because there's so few options on any given slate that every outcome matters hugely. I mean, just think of the number of outcomes on a full slate NFL. Like, one wide receiver goes off. Like, how much information does that give you, really, if it's like a 3% owned player? Well, in MMA, every fight is significant. And so every fight result, I would suspect, is going to result in significant strategy changes that you should be making. And so go ahead.
Well, you mentioned the one that people don't take care of the most, which is that min cash. Oh, right. I got a zero right. Like, the guy gets knocked out, first fight of the night. No matter what their ownership is, you have a lineup. It doesn't matter if you're playing large field, small field at this point. We'll discuss the differences between that. And your fighter just gets knocked out. Quick win bonus, the other guy, right? And it's like, oh, okay. Most people look at that and go, well, I got no shot to win, so who cares, right? They don't even bother making those swaps because they're a recreational player. They don't play for big money. It's like, what's the big difference if I take my $5 entry and make it $7.50 or it's $0? So they're not playing that game. They're just, well, maybe I swap to a lower owned fighter. They're just trying to get as high up as they possibly can. So they add even more variance to it. Guys like me and you that play more regularly or whatever know that there's value in just if you could rescue 5% of your lineups, like that sustains you over the course of playing so much volume over the course of the year. But most people will think of the opposite scenario of first fight. I'm just using the first fight of the night to make it sequentially easy to people to understand. Let's say you have the 9K fighter with the quick win bonus, right? Now you're sitting there with 125 points, and you're going, well, I have the 16% owned 9K fighter because other 9K fighters were probably more owned. Now what do I do? Like, now it's like, okay, well, that underdog that I faded because I didn't want to play the 32%, $7,700 guy, you may go, well, I have all the leverage that I have in my 16% on quick win bonus. Maybe I switch to the $7,700 guy. And now I say the word maybe. And I think this is key because some people have asked, does this, the sequential stuff, especially if you listen to the theory of DFS.com, my first course, like, people mistake sequential games all the time, thinking that, like, oh, what happens early in the night matters more. Because a lot of people have asked me, and I've seen in other Discords, oh, this prioritizes early fighters because if you get early underdogs, if they win, it now gives you that information to now rebuild your lineups. It's like, no. Think of if there was a 10-fight card, right? Just to make the math equal, right? After one fight, you have 10% of the information, right? You only have, if you looked at everyone's lineups, you'd only see one or two fighters in the lineups. Obviously, the people that stack the first fight are the people paying the rake primarily. But you'll see only that. You won't know what's in the rest of anyone else's lineups, how much salary was left on the table in some of these lineups. You don't know any of that. You do know one fighter's, two fighters' scores, and then that's it. After the 9th fight, you have 90% of the information. Of course,
Correct.
You only have one spot to maneuver with that information, but think on that scale of you actually have more information later. Like 6 fights in, you have 60% of the information, 70% of the information. When you get to the 90th thing, we'll see situations. I mean, it's very easy to see where it's the last fight of the night, typically the main event, and you'll take a look at your best lineup that has 5 wins in it going, can I win first? What's the highest I could win? Because I take a look and I say, okay, I have the main event favorite, 9,300 in this, and I'm 127 points from first place. I go, okay, if she scores 127, I'm good. But I see someone above me is 5 points higher with the same fighter, right?
Yep.
So obviously I'm blocked. So if I were to change to now the underdog, I have a much better shot at first place now because I'm the highest person. I'm the second highest person with a lineup slot available. And the first person is blocking me. Now I can choose to still play the main event and then I have better second place equity now, but I have no first place equity. And then you have to check the people behind you and go, are there people behind you that either share your same player or have the main event underdog? And then you have to make that calculation of, is it better for me to aim, even though it's a much lower probability of me getting first, is it worth it to do that? Or is it such a low probability that it's better to almost have a stranglehold on second place? That's what you normally should be doing.
Yes.
That calculation in your head. But
it's even more critical for it now than ever is the thing. Like, I feel like it's interesting because in the very largest of GPPs, I feel like there's so many lineups that it might actually not matter as much there because there's probably a good mixture of people swapping and not swapping, like in a huge NFL.
Daniel, I just want to hold on.
Yeah.
To get to the point that we're talking about now is that in the past, right? I want to make it simple for the people that may not understand the dynamics like this. That in the past, you wouldn't be able to swap. Like someone would block you would be in front of you blocking you, or you'd be blocking someone else. And there's nothing you could do. You're just sitting there going, well, the best I could do is come in 5th place, right? Because there's 4 people with my same lineup above me, right? Most likely they have that have enough salary available for that fighter. Now, maybe one of them actually left money on the table, and maybe, but that was all done pre-lock. They didn't do it. It's not based on the information we currently have. It's based on before the fights even started for the entire day. Now you have that information. So what's going to end up happening is in large field that you'll see there'll be a train of 6 people with the same lineup with the main event favorite. There'll be 8 people with another train with the main event underdog. Like where the underdog needs to win and score 72, or the main event favorite needs to win and score 89. And all those people could win first and split it.
Yeah.
Now, in the past, like nothing would change. But now you have to figure in maybe some of those people swap.
Yep.
Right.
And I think, I mean, it makes it impossible to analyze what people are up to too. You can't even tell what the lineup started as, because I mean, what you're describing is a very complicated problem. Like in a huge GPP, I feel like the difference between the best and the worst players is going to grow enormously because the advantage to having automated tools and figuring this stuff out with computers. I mean, it's like perfectly suited to my style of play, right?
Well, that's why I thought about it. That's why I said
I think people like me are going to have
doing that every 12 minutes or whatever.
But I think ultimately I'm going to play pretty rarely. I mean, what's the typical difference between the first fight time and the last fight time? Like many hours, right?
Yeah, I mean,
it's
typically
like
this
7 hours.
We'll start at 6 o'clock Eastern and not finish until midnight.
Yeah, or worse. So I mean,
pay-per-views, it's even more.
I mean, I hardly ever sweat, so it's because I'm a weirdo. So I usually I only have to worry about the start time, and now I can't do that anymore. So I don't think it's gonna be a big part of my play. I mean, I really like, even though I'm doing this for most of my work time is fantasy stuff. I'm pretty much an opportunistic player where like I'll look at my schedule. I'm like, oh, I can fit that slate in my schedule. I can't fit that slate in my schedule, because of family or other commitments or music stuff. And I think probably most casual players are the same way. And anybody who is taking the time to realize, hey, I actually need to be in front of my computer now. I think a lot of those people, this is just going to suck the entertainment value out, because it's really nice to have your lineup set and then you can just sweat the matches or not. You can watch the one that you have a lot of or not. But now if you're really trying to beat this, you're just going to have to be working it all night. And that's not going to be fun for me. But
people still don't understand. I want to get back to why you need to be working it and the contest in which you need to be doing so. Because I gave the example of a train of like, oh, there's 6 people with one lineup. I'm using this as the most extreme examples because you have to scale this to every part of the contest. Oh, there's 6 fights through. You have a $7,100 fighter that just put up 123 points. Most likely that guy is optimal, right? So now, like you said, with the different games that you're playing, like if essentially you either have to build your lineups throughout the night from an EV perspective. You will be giving away expected value by not doing this. Okay. Yes. It doesn't mean you can't win. It doesn't mean you can't make money. Just understand that you will be giving away expected value to the people that are doing it in the long run. That, let's say the first fight of the night is a $9,300 fighter, wins, puts up 92 points. Most of the time, that's not optimal. Most of the time. But if that happens to be optimal, there is what is the construction? If you have that fighter but left 800 on the table, dude, you have to make that a 50K lineup if you're aiming for first, because most likely that fighter has to be a top 6 fighter at that price. So either you're rebuilding that lineup, so if for some odd reason the 3% of the time that 92 is optimal, what does that type of lineup look like? Now, if you don't know, I can conceptualize what that looks like because I do things more directionally than you, Daniel. But most people aren't. And imagine you have 100 lineups. Yeah. So now, good luck swapping that. So, and then you also have the situations where you have the $7,200 fighter that puts up 130 points, 4 fights in. There's a 9K fighter that put up 110. That's possibly optimal. And you look and you go, okay, what lineups do I have both of these guys in? And you go, well, if this is optimal, like what are the ways that I have to make it so that it would, like, if you get like 3, let's say 3 big enough underdogs win. You get 123 out of a $7,100 guy. 2 fights later, you got 115 out of a $7,500 guy. And then a $6,900 underdog squeaks out a decision win for 76 points. Like, most likely that 76-point fighter, even though they're the cheapest, may not make the optimal because there's other 2 big underdogs that put up 100 whatever points. But there is a case where if the $9,600 most expensive fighter puts up 130, that you may need the $6,900 guy, and they actually make the optimal, even though they're the ninth highest scorer or whatever. Those calculations, like what I'm going through right now as an example, is something that you would either have to do in your head or be Daniel and build something that will tell you when those percentages are. And the reason why someone like Daniel, Nerdy Tenor, or people that run simulations, know how to code, is that you could do that in NBA. You could do that in NFL. But it's an absurd problem to solve because there's so many combinations. It would be ridiculous. In MMA, like we have 20 to 30 options in total.
Yeah.
Like you're gonna get to the point halfway through the card where there's only 10 fighters left, right? And then you have all these lineups, regardless of the contest size, and you could go, well, let me go through and see and just predict what all these lineups will look like. And then let me run the simulations to predict if this lineup is optimal, what does it look like? If this fighter is optimal, what does this look like? If this fighter is optimal, what does the optimal lineup look like? And for large field GPPs, basically, I mean, would you call this pretty much to the point of it being a solved game?
Close. I think it's tricky because in order to solve it exactly, you need to model all of the lineups at the beginning and then all of the different paths that you could take with swapping. I think that's intractable. However, I think you could get pretty close. And one of the things to keep in mind thinking about it now is that so the earlier you are in the slate, the harder it is to compute what to do, right? Because you have both the least amount of information, that is the least number of fights have completed, and all of the people you're facing have the most number of options left to them. So modeling that is truly large. I might take a shot at it just for fun, but I think it's really hard to do with any kind of precision. As you move on, though, when you get to the point where there's only 1, 2, maybe 3 fights left, you could imagine somebody just computing what all of the lineups every player could end up with are, and then simulating all of those and doing all sorts of clever things. So the importance of late swap goes up as you go through the slate, right? Because each decision is more momentous because you have more information and fewer choices, right? It's also easier to compute. So when you're literally down to the last fight, you could probably just figure this out on your own because there's 3 options. You have the lineups that are done, that have all 6 fighters, the lineups that have 4 fighters, in which case they have both of the last 2 fighters, right? So those are effectively done as well. And then you have the lineups that have 1 spot left, and they, depending on how much salary they have left, they either can choose fighter A or fighter B or both, or either, depending, right? You can just enumerate all of those. You could do this in Excel, right? And compute like how many of my opponents have a shot at first, or whatever cash line it is that you're looking at. And I think in terms of being directionally accurate, that kind of decision making will be mandatory toward the end of the fight. Like, it's going to be a big mistake not to look at that. I mean, you can just imagine, but I kind of want to take it down to the opposite end of the spectrum, just because I think it's a really simple example if people don't understand the value of late swap. So let's talk about a head-to-head, okay? So 5 of our 6 slots are both done. And we're on the last fight, and my opponent is beating me by 1 point, okay? And we both have enough salary to pick either of the last 2 fighters. So we're each going to pick fighter A or fighter B. If fighter A has a 70% chance to win, and fighter B has a 30% chance to win, let's just say our opponent picks fighter A. Well, by doing so, he can guarantee himself 70% equity, because my best choice is to go for fighter B and hope for an upset. If I choose fighter A, we tie and I lose, right? So he's guaranteed to get $70 if it's $100 head-to-head. $100 to first. If I don't late swap and I come in with my lineup and I have fighter A and my opponent is using this strategy, my equity is $0, right? I'm literally flushing $30 down the toilet. So it's critical to late swap in such a spot. Now it turns out your opponent can actually do better than $70 on average, because if you're facing someone and you know he's going to swap to the underdog, I can swap to the underdog and get $70, right? So the strategy is not stable. It's not an equilibrium, because if either of us has our fixed, basically the person who's ahead is going to want to pick the same fighter, and the person who's behind is going to want to pick the different fighter. So it turns out there's a strategy you can employ in this spot that gets the guy ahead $79 on average, no matter what the opponent does. And the strategy is to get a spinner and put 7 spots on the favorite and 3 spots on the underdog and play that fighter. And if you randomize in this way, then on average, no matter what my opponent does, I'm getting $79 on average. And the reason for this is if my opponent picks the favorite, well, 75% of the time I have the favorite and he loses. 30% of the time he doesn't have the favorite, he has the underdog, and he has 30% equity. So 30% times 70% is 0.21. So in that spot, on average, he's getting $21 and I'm getting 79. If he picks the underdog, it's exactly the same thing in reverse. 70% of the time, he does not dupe me, and he wins 30% of the time, which is, again, 70 times 30 is $21. And 30% of the time, I screwed him by swapping to the underdog. So these kinds of, this just shows you how much money is at stake when you get to the end. And it's a lot if you're not paying attention. So it's absolutely mandatory if you're in a head-to-head, or even just a position that's equivalent to a head-to-head. You can imagine a situation where you're in a 10-man and there's only 2 of you with any decent score. And it's a question of who's getting first and who's getting second. That's exactly the same spot, right? So you have to consider the probabilities and consider whether you want to, always swap or never swap or do some kind of mixture based on what your opponent is up to. Like if you know that they always stay with the chalk, you can exploit that by always going to the underdog. But if they do mixy, then you have to be a little careful. Or if they get really tricky and notice you're always swapping, they might punish you and swap themselves. So that's just an example, a really simple example of why, late swap is just such a big deal from an EV perspective. I mean, the difference from $21 and $30 and $0 is just a huge ROI shift in a head-to-head. So.
And also it makes so much more of a difference in a binary sport that is sequential like MMA. It's not like NBA late swap where you start out with games at 7 Eastern, and then it's like, there's an 8 o'clock game where maybe someone's out, someone's in, or whatever. The information you have is like only half the game is gone in the 7 o'clock games. So you're like, well, even though they had a bad first rotation, this guy could still end up with 50 points. They could make it back. You could see, obviously, if some guy gets injured in the early game, that's a different story. But like the amount of information you're getting, even as the slate goes on, like you can't tell who's going to be the best scorer, who's not going to be the best scorer definitively. While in MMA, it's like, dude, every 20 minutes, you're gonna know. And even if the scoring is a little bit behind, you're still you'll be able to estimate. I mean, there are plenty of times where it's a 3-round fight, goes to decision, and we don't know what the final 3rd round count of the score is before even the next fight starts.
Right.
But like, okay, they're sitting there with 68 with the round 3 icon. It's like, Well, what happened in round 3? Well, there was a takedown, some control time, some strikes. I'm going to guess another 18 points. And just add that to that, and then reconsider what my late swaps are. Now, there are going to be people that like you, if you were to do it, you wouldn't be able to wait for DraftKings to update the scores. It's like you need that extra time because you may only have a matter of minutes to do all your computations and swap everything out. So you may decide to scrape from ESPN, right? And here's an estimated score just so you could run stuff while someone like me, or a normal person with that is estimating or not or waiting, is like, oh my God, the next fight's going to lock before this score is over. And then they don't swap. And it's like, no, I could tell if, and it may matter, especially 7 fights in, if this $7,800 fighter scores 86 or 78, right? Especially in that mid-range, on how often that makes them optimal compared to other scores that have happened throughout the card. And if you're sitting there going, well, I'm not gonna swap until I see the score, like you've now given up some EV, where once the score comes in after you estimate it, it's like, oh yeah, I should have changed this out to that out. And by not doing so, you're giving up stuff. But I also want to highlight, Daniel, and you could explain why these effects, because here's another misnomer that people that I've been seeing on Reddit or Twitter. I don't play the large field contests, so I don't know why it matters. When in fact that it matters more in the smaller field stuff than it does the large. Actually, I think that if you were to play 3 entries into the 555, right? Like the 400 man, 300 man, or whatever, or you play the $200 triangle 200 man, the 166 man contender 100 man, like you'd more like that versus those entries. If you threw all those entries that you played in those contests, those 5 entries, into the large field contest and just never swap the ones in the large field contest, I don't think your equity on never late swapping those is as dramatic as if you decided in the smaller field to say, I'm never late swapping. Like you would rather be more cognizant in your small field entries, but people view it as, well, all these people running simulations have 150 lineups and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, dude, you should be doing it. Technically, you should be doing it even if you only have 1 lineup in a single entry contest. Can you explain, but instead of me doing so, explain why when you play single entry 3 max, it actually matters more?
Yeah, so just imagine, I guess the main MMA contest on DraftKings is typically $15 and, 20,000 entries or so, 20, 30,000 entries. The diversity of lineups is going to be much higher the bigger the contest, simply because there are so many entries in it. And so if you're in a small contest, let's say you're in a 10-man, right? And the chance that you get into a situation where you can make dramatic plus EV moves is much higher because the number of opponents is smaller. So you can get a situation where half the field is basically dead to win any money. And because of this, it's really critical for you to change your strategy, because instead of playing a 10-man, now you're playing a 5-man. It's like you've gotten rid of half the field, right? It takes longer to get to that kind of a point in a big GPP. So like the percentage shift is going to be greater the smaller the number of people. So, and the number of people you need to beat is going to be much smaller. So it also should be much easier to compute. Like you should be able to eyeball it. You can imagine a spot where there's a 10-man, 2 relatively chalky fighters have busted and half the field has one or both of them, and you have neither. And now you can improve your EV dramatically by swapping onto things that such that it's unlikely people will catch you. That's much harder to do in a big GPP when you have so many others to beat you. The path to first is much easier in a small GPP. So it's almost like each step you take to getting first is much larger in a smaller contest. You know what I mean?
Well, I want to use the difference of your goal in a large field GPP versus your goal in a small field GPP is actually different. They go, well, you're still playing for first. Yes, I'm playing for first, but first means different in those contests. When you're playing the 30,000 entry large field GPP, you are essentially trying to find the optimal lineup. Like most slates, the optimal lineup, the best, highest possible scoring lineup, is more likely than not going to be the winning GPP lineup. So in the situation where you have a mid-range fighter that puts up 80 points, and it's like most likely not optimal, like in the large field, you'd be correct. But in the 555, you may win 50K with that fighter in your lineup and just having 6 winners. I came in like 14th place or something, 10th place in the 555 like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I had 2 losers in my lineup. It was a slate with a lot of stuff going on. Like there are going to be slates where the winning score of the smaller field stuff is going to be dramatically lower. That had I had late swap available to me then, and I saw that this dynamic, we always talk in GPP about, well, you want 6 winners and the highest scoring that possible, so don't stack a fight. Now with late swap, if I see that the better way to get equity is to go, well, I think I could get first in the small field contest by just because many other people have busted, I'm just going to now stack the main event to block everyone instead of taking a risk on the 9K fighter putting up enough points as it is. And then secondly, if I'm not near first place, I may choose to do that just to lock up min cash equity. Yet pre-lock, you would never build those lineups. You would,
that's right,
because you're playing for first place, and it's like in a large field GPP, either in a small field GPP, you're still probably looking for 6 wins. But if we now know, we had a slate 2 weeks ago where only like one dog won, and like Candelario at 35 points, as the slate went on, was more likely to actually be in the optimal lineup. A lot of people, if you didn't compute that, they would look at that lineup and go, it's a dead lineup. Let me play for min cash equity. The smarter people would have gone, let me play for that being in the optimal lineup and improve my chances of actually possibly winning first. But without knowing those dynamics, you can't make those swaps. And in the small field stuff with that Candelario, it would be that you would actually, if you didn't realize that he could be in the winning lineup without even being optimal, like without being the large field optimal, you would have said, oh, because that was like the second fight of the night on that card. You would have started swapping off and saying, well, I got to take this guy out, that guy out. And then by the end of it, you would have been like, oh my God, I swapped off like what could have been the winning lineup because I overreacted to that information. So it's like, this is the game that you'd be playing more so in smaller field stuff, only because you don't need the best. You just need the best lineup of 300, not the best possible lineup.
Yeah, and I think for large field, so to your point about pretty much needing the optimal lineup, and relatively more of the equity is up first in a large field than a small field, obviously, as a percentage, and obviously as a multiplier of entry fee, because you need to get to the optimal lineup. I imagine that on a per lineup basis, on average, not late swapping will matter quite a bit less because you're still just trying to get to the optimal. And a lot of the equity is going to be about min cash, about saving lineups like you were talking about before. Like that's going to be a far more frequent occurrence where you're in the big GPP, you've missed on a key chalk fighter, you have no first place equity or even 100th place equity, and now you're just trying to make the cash line, which changes everything. Like, that's going to be a vastly more common occurrence than making swaps that have to do with winning first, right? But in the 10-man example, like, every move you make is far more likely to change your payout. Like, if you pass one player in a 10-man, there's a very good chance that changes your payout. If you
passing one man, Daniel, passing one in a 10-man, like put it in relation to a 30,000 person contest.
Right.
Passing one person in a 10-man is like passing 3,000 people in the 30,000 contest, and like
that's right.
Those payouts don't, like, going from third to second in your 10-man. Even if it's like $50 to first, $30 to second, and $20 to third, and it's a $10 contest, right? Like a nice flat whatever. It's like going from fourth to third is the min cash, and going from third to second increases your payout by 50%.
50%, yeah.
But in a large field contest, it's like that represents 3,000 lineups. Like, most likely, you're not going to be moving 3,000 spots at once that as often as you would be in a 10-man contest.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's going to be really interesting, the small field stuff. And I think if I ever do have a Saturday and time to develop what I want to develop, that's what I would try and play. I think that's, again, I have mixed feelings about this. I think it's really fun and interesting from a game perspective, but I just can't see myself playing much anymore just because I don't have the time to be around most Saturdays.
Well, also another thing I want to highlight, because I'm just a lot of the myths of like, oh, this, like, you hear people, it's like me and you are like, well, this sucks. It's like, because it gives better players an edge. And it's like, well, aren't you better players? Don't you want that edge? It's like, here are the downsides, though. One, you mentioned the time. Is the time worth doing? Setting everything up, taking advantage of this, knowing that if you don't do it, someone else will be doing it, and you'll be losing equity. Number two is that like the ecosystem, the more casual players that don't do it, the quicker they go broke. Poker analogy.
Ecosystem's tricky, though. It's hard to predict. It's also good to remember that we're in a bit of a bubble. Like, if you're like trying to win, that already puts you in the minority. And I could imagine there are a fair number of players for whom it's almost entirely an entertainment product, and the tilt they go on when their fight is canceled because somebody didn't make weight after lock is such an awful experience for that kind of player that they might actually be willing to give up quite a bit in EV not to experience that, because they're just doing it for fun as it is. But I do understand the idea that, like, I mean, you don't want it to so favor the better players that the game dries up. I mean, I guess the question is, like, it's what you always talk about. Your EV is primarily determined by the number of weak players in your contest, and how will those ratios change? Like, the better players are going to get even more better, and the worst players are going to get worse. And how does that
but
play
I'm
out?
not even sure, Daniel, depending on your play style, because another thing that I want to discuss when it comes to this is, we know, especially in the large field stuff, but I mean, even in the small field stuff, I mean, duplication is bad regardless. It's bad for you regardless, but it's more pronounced the more you get duplicated and the more top heavy the payouts are. This is bad for people that build like on the basis of uniqueness. Now, personally, when I play large field, I don't optimize and maximize my lineups for uniqueness, but still, like, under fives. Like, I don't mind being duped 2 or 3 times. But what's going to happen here, and the amount, I said it, and people thought the opposite. It's like, oh, we're going to get a lot more solo winners. I go, no, we're actually going to get much less solo winners now. They go, well, how is that the case? Well, it's the case is because I could get to the same unique lineup that you made pre-lock, post-lock. So from a very simple explanation, a simple occurrence is that one of the things that people don't do enough of in MMA is build lineups that leave salary on the table, right? A lot of people, if you examine Showdown, NFL, or any type of a very limited field, limited option contest, that 50K lineups are much more likely to be duplicated than 49.9 lineups, than 49.8 lineups. Like it's almost like a hockey curve like that.
Yep.
So a 49.4 lineup is way less going to be duplicated than a 49.8 lineup, but a 48.8 lineup is going to be even less duplicated. But the difference is now is that, let's say me and you, like Daniel, let's say you're a don't dupe me bro, right? You're building a lot of lineups with 4 underdogs in it, right? Your average salary in your lineups are 48.5. And in the past, before late swap, lock would happen. You'd download the CSV, you'd see everyone's lineup, and you go, okay, out of my 150, 132 are unique, right? 147 are under 5s, and you got 3 lineups that you screwed up with, and that's, they duped 7 times. Well, now, let's say I built 150 lineups that all spent 50,000, right? And I look at mine, and all of my lineups are duped 20 plus times. In the past, it'd be like, oh, if we ran out this contest in a simulation model, it would show that you make a lot of money and I lose a good amount of money because I'm 67-way splits and 42-way splits, and you win $100,000 here and there, and it makes up for all of the other times. Well, all your 150 lineups, after the first fight, this happens, and like, well, I could just leave salary. I could take my set and have it match some of the lineups in your set you thought were unique in the past when lock happened and you couldn't swap. Like, I could get to your lineups now, and it would be more evident when I do need to get to your lineup. So you're sitting there in the past, before there was late swap, going, wow, this lineup, right? The fight, the last fight of the night, you'd be sitting there. You're in 123rd place with the main event favorite with a unique lineup that just needs to score 68 points to win solo first. Like, because no one throughout the course of the night could get to that lineup because it's a 48-4 lineup with this weird guy and that weird guy in. Well, now you're going to be sitting there and there's going to be 3 other people with you because throughout the course of the night, they managed to get to that lineup because, well, they had this guy in, so they switched to that guy, and then they go, well, I think a lot of people will still have this fighter, so let me leave 400 on the table there. And then, oh, this guy lost in this other fight, so let me now go down. Like, all these people that build for uniques, their lineups will be less unique because, right, you get the point of me. A lot of people miss that point of like having unique lineups is going to be much tougher now because you can make the people that are even simulating could predict how unique they are with the current ownership as the fights go on.
Yeah, I think just imagine you're at a point in a big GPP where it's clear you're going to need 4 particular fighters. So the winner of the it's basically a bunch of 2v2s. So if there's only 6 fighters left, that's at most 15 combos. And imagine you're looking through the CSV and you discover there are 300 people in this spot who have 2 holes in their lineup. You can quickly figure out, it's relatively easy to figure out the relative probabilities of all these things and act accordingly, right? So yeah, you would expect that over time, the more people that are taking advantage of late swap, the flatter the distribution of final lineups is going to be. That is, the more similar the ownerships will be between lineups. So there'll be fewer uniques. and probably fewer. And because there's fewer total uniques, that means there should be fewer massive dupes as well, because people will be able to get off of those. So yeah, I think that's right. I think you would expect far fewer solo winners over time in the biggest of GPPs. You can even imagine a situation where somebody manages to maneuver themselves into a situation where they're guaranteed to get one of the winning lineups because they got enough of the combos to fill them all out.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to mention before. If I were to play 150, I was fooling around with Excel yesterday to see how I would do this. I don't know what it would be called, but because someone mentioned in chat, it's similar to this concept, but not exactly this concept about like what would with 150 lineups, don't you shift to a fairly even distribution of fighters the first few fights, then rebuild as you gain more info? And I don't think it's that linear as that, but like in my model, like I predict like who is over-owned. I play an exploitative strategy. So like to me, I view like the diversification element to be the difficult part of MMA, where it's like, well, MMA is high variance, so any fight, even the biggest underdog wins probably even more than their ownership. So to have none is weird in 150 lineups.
Yeah,
but there are guys that are over that I view as, oh, they're under-owned, so I'm going to have more of them. The problem comes in is that how do I have more of those fighters and then pre-lock still have enough of a distribution to cover, like you said, as many of the good combos as possible? Well, with late swap now, that I don't have to worry about that at lock. I could instead, like for instance, in lineup HQ, we have the uniqueness factor, right? Unique players 1, unique players 2, unique players 3. That gives you diversification. And every lineup with unique players 3 has to be a 3v3 of any other lineup in your set, right? Now in MMA, if you do unique players 3 and you're building 150, like you're going to get some weird distributions because, especially a 12 fight card, like it's not even going to, it's going to break before you even get to 300, right? Because it can't even have a 3v3 off of any of the other lineups. So like, if I see that, okay, I want to make sure that I have a lot of these 3 fighters, fighter A, fighter B, fighter C, because I believe they're heavily under-owned. The problem is that everyone else is kind of efficiently owned or something. And it's like, what's the distribution I should have to the other 3 fighters in those lineups, to make this an example, that I have a lot of these 3 ABC in a 6-player lineup, but D, E, and F, what combinations of those? Now, pre-lock before late swap, I'd have to go, well, let me give the best distribution I can. Well, in this scenario, I could set unique players to 1 and make all those I could make 75 lineups or whatever. I would with the 2v2s. I mean, I could make a train. I mean, there's no reason. There's literally no reason for me to not make a train of the same 75 lineups and then go, well, at fight 4, I'll know this. And then I'll take those 75 lineups, and then now I'll get more diversity right there. And then after the 6th fight, I'll know another thing. And then, so I don't even have to worry about that like how to find the right combo. I'm not stuck in the situation where I got the right 3 fighters, and I'm like, oh, and I have 10 of these lineups, and 7 have this guy in, and 3 have that guy in, but none have this guy in. And it's like, I would love to be able to have every single other fighter in those 10 lineups, but I can't do it because there's no late swap. And someone else has that lineup, and it's unique, and it's only duped twice. And I'm sitting there going, I'd love to swap off so I could have 8 of these combinations rather than like 2 or 3 of them. That's what we're talking about when it comes to why there will be less uniques. And if you were to build, I call it the pyramidal kind of thing.
Right.
Like you start from one like point and go, what do I believe the optimal lineup is going to look like and who's more likely to be in it? I want more of those guys in the lineup, and then save the distribution, save those choices and do them as the fights go on rather than beforehand and trying to solve the how much distribution you should have. Like to me, from a directional standpoint, without having simulations is the way that I would solve it. And then as the fights go on, just go, okay, what do I got to do here? What do I have to do there? How could I the lineups with 6% on Trezano like last week? I'd be like, okay, let me segment these out. These are going to be optimal lineups possibility. Anything that doesn't have Trezano, I'm playing for min cash. I'm playing for min cash equity. I can't win with a $7,100 123 pointer. And now I'm looking at those lineups going, who's the next fight? Well, it's fighter X versus fighter Y. It's like, well, I currently have fighter X. Because I had like 18 lineups with Trezano in it. So I'm like, I have 8 with this and 4 with that. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't want 8 with this next fighter. I'm going to now switch it off. So I have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 and start kind of like doing that pyramid of like, how many combinations can I make with these lineups so it improves my shot at getting the optimal rather than going like all in on like, well, the next 2 fighters, like I'm just going to play all of the next fight. Like you don't have to do that. You could start now figuring that out as you go. And guys like you, if you were to take on that task, would be able to solve that problem much easier and more accurately than me kind of doing it more directionally and by eyesight.
Yeah. I also think we should address one of the comments about, which is a thought I had too, which is, so we already established that having more choices gives more of an edge to whoever makes those choices better, right? And I'm including in these choices the choice to not late swap, right? So given that having more choices is good, it makes me think that the earliest fights should be slightly discounted because every time you take an early fighter, that lineup has fewer choices to make down the line. And I think that makes sense intuitively, but I have no idea what the magnitude of that is. My suspicion is that in the largest GPPs, it probably matters very little because you're shooting for the optimal. And if the optimal is an early fighter, you need that guy, right? My guess is that you get more of a discount in projection, so to speak, in small field stuff because the value of each decision on average is going to be much larger. But I have no idea how to figure out how big that should be.
No, but that makes sense. Well, you would try to figure that out to a precise level. I would figure
out. Well, I don't even know if I know how to do that.
Right, but what you're describing is very similar to NFL. So like NFL, we get like pretty much 2 lock times. So when I play like cash games or small field GPPs,
yeah,
like let's say I'm playing a one-off wide receiver in my cash lineup or something, and I could choose between 2 guys that are pretty much projected the same. I typically will choose the 4 p.m. guy rather than the 1 p.m. guy because if they project about the same, I'd rather have more information because at 4 p.m. I may know that I'm way behind, and even the guy that guy is going to be too chalky that I need to now swap my defense and do something else rather than be locked into a guy early, or vice versa. Vice versa could be like, well, now that I know that my 16% owned guy that was cash viable, but this construction wasn't used as much, I'm now 23 points above the train, like the very popular cash train, and that cash train has that exact wide receiver that I'm playing. It's like, well, great.
Right.
Leave him in and block. I mean, you get more information that way. So to me, I view the earlier fighters, I think people are going to, Daniel, the point that you made earlier about there are 2 games that you're playing is maybe the most important thing. Literally the most important thing from a macro level of once the fights start, every fight goes by, you're playing a different game. Think of it as a completely new slate. So people are thinking of the first scenario of, I'm going to play 100 lineups, or I'm going to play whatever. I'm going to play 2 lineups. And I'm going to play fighter A in the first fight and fighter B in the first fight. And if they put up a big score, now we know that guy is most likely, or woman, is most likely going to be optimal. And I got it. And now I know that the people that don't have this fighter, so I have one lineup that is close to the optimal and one lineup that's obviously dead. So now you're playing 2 different games. In this lineup that has the 120 point underdog, how do I make the optimal? This one that has the 5-point favorite that got knocked out, how do I get min cash equity? Like, right. That's what we're talking about here. But as the slate goes on, you get more and more information. So if for instance, let's say I have 2 lineups, and I'm keeping it very simple instead of having this like MME 150. So let's say I have 2 lineups and I have neither of the first fight. Okay? So now let's think of all the different possibilities. So let's think of the possibility that people bring up. The big underdog, the underdog destroys 120 points. And now I'm sitting there with 2 lineups that have neither. Well, I have the same amount of information that you have now. I'm now playing the game that you're playing with your losing fighter lineup. I'm playing min cash. I know I can't win. I do not have that lineup. It's so unlikely that 123 point underdog is not going to be optimal. Like, you'd say, well, 6 fighters can beat that. Like, yeah, I guess so. But good luck. So now I know what game I'm playing. So now my lineups, I look at and I go, what do I care about being? Why am I playing a 3% owned big dog? Like, dude, I just want to get 5 winners. Can I get 5 winners? Can I get 4 good winners? I get the same amount of information, even though you have a lineup that is more likely to be optimal. Yes, win equity, but you also have a lineup that has 0 points, that is way behind my 2 lineups that have nothing there. So, like, I now have 2 lineups beating you at this second game. I can't beat you at the first game. Now, let's say the scenario is that the first fight happens and it's a dud. It's a stand-up. The winner gets 62 points. The loser gets 30 points. And it's like, yeah, most likely, you probably ain't going to be winning with that. All of a sudden, my 2 lineups that I have is playing for first place. Both of your lineups are now not playing for first place at all. Now both your lineups are playing for min cash equity. So to think in terms of like, what do you do in earlier fights versus later fights? I think it still comes down to the more information you have, the more consequential your late swap decisions are. So yes. if you were to implement that in your projections or whatever, there would be some type of penalty for earlier fighters versus later fight. Like, it's so much more valuable now to have a main event fighter or a co-main event fighter, because now it gives you late swap options in the time that it impacts you the most than it does having fighters from the first fight.
Right. That all sounds good to me. And I think the other thing I'm pretty confident in is that the discount should be greater in the smaller contests. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the numbers are, but it seems obvious that because in the GPP you have to get optimal, it hurts more when you don't get a high scoring early fighter. It costs you
right,
more.
But I mean, I just want to mention in the 555, I think the other night, I don't think Trezano was even in the winning lineup.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I actually made money on that slate too and did not, because I had more of that fighter than the field, I think. And I think I placed pretty high in a medium field thing with a losing fighter as well. Got like 4th or something. Yeah, but I think it's all very interesting. I think another, we should bring up I don't remember if you raised it or somebody else did, but somewhat overblown, but not entirely without merit issue of collusion.
I brought it up that like you said on this show. I don't know if I could stick around on Saturdays to swap all these things, and like what stops me and you from saying, hey Daniel, you set up the system,
Yeah.
And then you go out and have fun with your family and do whatever the hell you want when the card starts. And I'll play lineups also, and I'll run your system, and swap all our 300 lineups out, or whatever amount of lineups that we have out. So you get the reward for that, for doing what you do, and then you have a proxy. You're just, all you need is an intern of like someone that's willing to press a button and export CSVs, and then you go off. And now, obviously, if you have an actual intern to do that, like, that's perfectly fine to do. I mean, like, there are plenty of people that play on an account with multiple people. That is not against the terms of service.
Sure.
But it's whether or not someone that is also participating in the contest and says, like, hey, you're good at making a system like that, especially in MMA where there may only be so many combos. It's like, well, if we had 450 lineups and you run your stuff, like, we'll probably make the optimal like 90% of the time.
Yeah,
based on
I think,
and there you go.
Yeah. So I've said before that I think the only places in the past I've really been worried about people colluding is the very smallest contests, like 6-mans and less, because even without blocking, just knowing what one other lineup is in such a tiny field, it's like you have a sneak peek at the ownership in a way. So you can be, not being correlated with one other player in a 6-man is a large advantage, right? So I don't have any evidence that this has happened to me in any of the contests I play. I do play some of the smaller stuff. I've been experimenting with it in baseball, and but I wouldn't be shocked if it happens. But what I used to say is I really wasn't worried about this for GPPs, just because of the amount of combinations that could be picked. It's just seems like a rare scenario where someone could really get a huge leg up by colluding. However, I'm afraid that you could easily imagine a scenario in MMA. Just imagine there's 2 people tied for first in a big GPP who know each other. They have 1 spot left, and there's 1 player directly behind them. It would be very easy for them to say, you take fighter A and I take fighter B, and then we're guaranteed to block that third guy. Whereas before, if we didn't talk, there was a chance that the 2 of us made the same decision and the third guy could beat us by going the other way. Now that possibility is gone, and we've basically robbed him of his first place equity by colluding. And I think because the combination of it being a binary sport with tiny number of options, that actually does concern me a little bit. Where previously I would have been like, collusion, the idea of collusion in a big GPP is overblown. It's not that big of a deal, because the advantage of knowing an extra few hundred lineups in a gigantic GPP just isn't that big of a deal. But with late swap and MMA specifically, I think it actually could be a big deal, unfortunately. So, yeah, I don't know.
But is it a good thing? Is it a good thing now that you're saying, hey, I could probably beat this game. You could build your supercomputer to do everything, as I joke about, and you don't even want to do, and you're concerned about certain things that would reduce your edge. You're concerned that the time involved, that your time is worth more than this increased edge. Even if you have an increased edge, but it's like, well, Saturday nights are high value time in your life, and it's not worth it. That it's very similar to like me in NBA. I don't play NBA DFS as often as I did in the past, because on certain nights I'm just like either I have to be all in and do this from 7 to 11, or I'm all out. So I'm not gonna put my wife through, or we have plans or something. Like I'm either playing or I'm not. Or I look at a slate and it'd be like, it's a 10-game slate. The start times are such that there's only like 1 late game. So like a lot of stuff will be done by like 8 or 8:30 Eastern. I'd be like, okay, I can play this slate, because at least then at like 8:30, I'm pretty much done. There's this 1 late game, but most likely there's nothing that I need to really do that much. Like, maybe there's going to be plenty of people like you that goes, well, now I'm not gonna play because it's primarily due to the fact that you know how much edge it is, and if you're going to be exploited by other people doing it, like it's almost not even worth it for you to play with your original edge.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I feel very similarly about NBAs. I play very little full slate NBA, partly because I don't think I'm that great at it. I think I'm okay, but yeah, it's not just it isn't only the time and scheduling. It's also, if I'm gonna do it, like I need to decide in advance that I'm doing it, and often I don't know whether I want to be doing something Saturday night or not until relatively later, and I don't want to have basically locked out the possibility of seeing my friends or going to a movie or whatever it is that other people want to do, because I decided 4 hours ago I was going to play this, this slate. So yeah, I think it's just a question of time for me. So I'd love to get into it on those days that I do have the time. I just don't know when those days are going to be.
But building that solution, solving this problem, I think it's a complex problem, but can still be solved better than others. Like some people are making out that this is a much harder problem than you think. But I think it's still easy enough that you would get a significant edge even in just pure estimation.
Yeah, so I want to expand on that. This is a really important point. So a lot of people I talk to who know the kinds of things I'm up to sort of use the word solve a little bit too much. So even if you're using an approach in the neighborhood of mine, there's still a lot of approximation that has to go on. Like the projection sources in your simulations are best guesses, right? They're hopefully unbiased and close to correct, but they're never going to be perfect. And there's things like that all up and down the whole thing. So with that said, I make the analogy from poker. There are certain poker games for which we do not have anywhere close to solved the game, in quotes. And nevertheless, the computer is just so much better than humans that it doesn't matter. So you can still study and train with these things that we know are very far from perfect. They're still way better than people. And I think something like that could be the case here, where even if you get, to use your term, directionally accurate with your simulations or your resolves or whatever you want to call it that happen throughout the slate, that's probably going to still give you a significant edge, even if it's pretty far from perfect. So just, excuse me, thinking about the first thing I would try for MMA, and I'm not going to give all the details here. I know for a fact it has one huge limitation, but I think it would still crush relative to people not doing anything like it. And that's knowing exactly where it falls down. So I think it's going to be a continuum. I think what'll be really interesting for me to see is sharp people like you who are not running their own sims, like what kind of an edge is available, because you're going to be caught between the sim bros and the toilet lineup people. Make a lineup on the toilet and only swap when a fighter is scratched, right? So it'd be interesting to see what can be done there. Again, my suspicion is that in the largest of GPPs, the difference between doing something reasonably well and doing it more sim-based is actually going to be smaller, which is a little counterintuitive because it sounds like it's a bigger data problem. It's much harder to solve precisely, but I think it'll be pretty obvious how to get closer to doing the right thing, especially with the min cash lineups, like the lineups that used to be hopeless, but now you have a shot with late swap. But anyway, we'll see. I'm just guessing. I think the thing I really have no idea is like how much are the field sizes going to change after this, because I think the people who have 1 to 5 lineups, probably it's not going to change that much. The people in the middle and the people who put in 150 could change a lot. I know I probably my volume's gonna be drastically less, and it's gonna come down to like which days I can play. It's not even the amount I play. Like the amount I play on any given slate probably goes up, but the number of slates I play goes down. So I don't know how that all washes out for DraftKings and the ecosystem. No clue.
Well, I plan on just playing more single entry 3 max than large field, because number one, I think the edge is big. We've described the edge is bigger in small field.
Yeah.
And number two, I don't have an I'm not going to be able to build a good enough automated process for me to do these swaps as it is.
Right.
So why bother? I could still, I could make 50 lineups for a large field. It just, now, all that means now is that essentially I'm saying that I no longer enjoy watching the fights, because I'll just be at the computer swapping 50 lineups, like waiting for the next fight to go and then going, okay, let me rerun ownership. Let me rerun this. What other lineups? Even if I'm just eyeballing it, it'll take me another 20 minutes just to swap. And then by that time, the next fight, and it just becomes, okay, 14 fights are done. And like, it felt like I spent an entire, like a work day. I'm just at the computer, because it's not even like NBA. It's not like NBA, where it's like, I could probably leave everything alone unless something major happens here or there. I could swap some of these low-level lineups, the snowflake lineups, to try to get a min cash more, these to try to win more. But stuff is going on so much that there's no discernible time frames of anything. Here, there's like literally every 20 minutes. It's like this. Like I can't sit in front of my couch and watch anything and have it be enjoyable. So to get the extra edge in large field, it's like, dude, I believe I could eyeball it and swap on the couch on my phone with 6 to 8 single entry 3 max type lineups. That I'm fine. And most likely, what a lot of times, Daniel, what I do is that I may play 6 lineups, but I'll play them in multiple contests. So I'll play the $100 single entry, but I also have it in the $40 single entry, because I'm like evening it out, so the volume on each lineup is about equal. So if I have a 555 lineup, it won't be in anything else, but the $100 lineup may be in others, and then I could just swap. I could now bracket off and go, well, in the $100 single entry, I'll move to this guy, but I'll split this lineup so the $40 one has someone else, and you can still do that kind of pyramidal type of process even with lineups that you have. And then let's say I also have it in a large field contest, and the large field contest, I'm like, okay, I'm going to split this one off and make it look like if these 2 fighters are in the optimal, what would this optimal look like? And leave it at that, because I'm playing for the optimal in that contest. And like, you end up getting around to the same point and the same type of work that you'd be doing, but at least you're dealing with less lineups, and you could possibly sit on the couch and do it reasonably well enough that you don't have to run back to your computer all the time.
Yeah, maybe. I feel bad for a lot of people with this change. Like, anybody who likes the puzzle of DFS but doesn't want to stay around for every fight is one. But another is people like you who like both the MMA sport itself and also DFS. Like, this sucks. Like, how are you going to enjoy the sweat anymore? Like, you can't. Maybe at the very end.
Well, it's more of that there's be a lot more anxiety, because it's not a matter of, okay, everything locks at 6 or whatever. We get all the ownership. I'm going, wow, this guy's way higher on than I thought, and this guy's way low. And I look, oh, did I make the right decisions? I could before the first fight even started, I could evaluate whether or not I did well.
Yeah.
Right. And then all at that point, all I'm doing is just sitting down going, let's see how this plays out.
Yes.
And let's see where I am in the contest. And people will argue, be like, well, this 9K guy scored 108. Like, but if this guy scores more than him, he won't be in the optimal. And then you have to kind of like say, well, the chance is most likely going to be, because now you're going to keep track of how the slate's going. You're not going to have any of those conversations anymore because you're going to be too busy looking, going, well, the next fight locks at 5:45. It's now 5:38. I have 7 minutes, right? But that fight doesn't even start for another 15 minutes because the lock times are slightly less. And then by the time you get to the end, from the looks of it, these lock times, as you go through the card, these fights may lock like 2 fights before it even happens.
Yeah.
Like the main event may actually lock before like the third to last fight even starts. Like the first fight, like the second fight will lock. Like what they'll have, what it looks like on the times is that, let's say there's a 4 p.m. start time. The first fight will lock at 4 p.m., but it won't start until 4:10, right? And then they have a 20-minute interval. So 4:20, the next fight locks, but it won't start till 4:35. And then the next fight locks at 4:40, but it won't start till 5:05. And then by the time you get to like the 10th fight, like the 10th fight, the 11th fight locks before the 8th fight even started. And the main event locks 4 fights before it's like, they say in the description that they have reserved the right to bump up stuff. But dude, how do you plan? I mean, like, dude, imagine doing like running simulations and doing like, dude, you're not even sure when the things are going to lock sometimes.
I know. I mean, the more I think about it, I may just pass up on it altogether. It's just the pain in the ass factor is going to be through the roof. I think set it and forget it is greatly underrated. Like, I really like knowing I'm going to do this for an hour before lock and be done with it, and then I can do whatever I want. Can sweat it or not.
The argument I made, I talked to my VIP host.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet. I need to send him a mail.
Right. They reached out to me because I tweeted about it. The 2 things that I said is, one, the better solution to this. The better solution. This is the one that I suggested when they sent out the survey. I filled it out.
Yeah.
Said, you want to avoid automatic zeros. I get it. People don't like it. But you also want to make it so that you don't have to late. But they also want to, I also know that they want to make it so they don't have to recode stuff. So when they say, well, only unlock the fighters that are like that are canceled versus this, and the start time, like they don't change their code. Like, unless they have a compelling reason, they don't want to do that. To recode how a contest works. I suggested that, why don't, depending on the salary, you make your choice. If a fight gets canceled after lock, the favorite gets 70 and the underdog gets 30. It's like the favorite gets enough points where it doesn't screw you at all, but most likely won't be in the winning lineup. So it's like you can't win first place pretty much. But if you get 7, it's like, okay, you increase your min cash equity either side. And it's like, and if you want to do that in relation to salary, make a multiplier times 6 or something. A 9K fighter gets 82 points instead of 76 or whatever it is. That's what you do. And then you still make it no late swap. So now you don't have people pissed that they got a 0. I'm like, I think that's a better solution. And then number 2, my counterpoint to them doing it in MMA is that if you're doing this in MMA, why don't you do it in the sport that is like 5 times more liquidity or 10 times more liquidity in PGA? Like, dude, there are withdrawals after lock in PGA like 10 times more than MMA. This happens in MMA like 2 or 3 times a year, and I don't see them making tea time. This guy locks at 6 o'clock. This guy locks at 6:10. This guy locks at 6:20. It's like, what makes MMA any different than golf when some 12% owned fighter, when Hideki Matsuyama at 22% owned decides 3 holes in that he's going to withdraw with a back injury? Like, they get just as many complaints for that because it's this similar type of thing, but they don't. Seems like, no, we'll never. We'll because they probably look at that and go, dude, we have to have like 800 lock times then for every time.
I dread that they might do something to golf because, on a purely selfish note, it's just the amount of volume I put in is much, much greater in golf than it is in MMA, just because there's so many more contests and golf is big. I I had an idea for MMA. Another solution would be if your fighter is canceled. If your fight is canceled, then the favorite gets the lowest winning score on the slate, -1.
Right. Well,
And
that's
the
a very
loser,
similar concept
similar idea. The loser
right.
gets the worst score, right? Whatever that is, which is going to be close to
Neil
0.
in chat says, haven't they changed lock times in the past when an MLB game was postponed so that people could take players out? Why not just set every fighter's lock time at the first fight, adjust to late if canceled? Well, first off, they can't lock the fighters. Remember, when stuff gets locked, you get to see the ownership.
Yeah.
So you never want to make it that a fight gets locked and then unlocked, and then people could change, and we already saw ownership. Which let me just tell you, I wouldn't be shocked if that happens on Saturday.
Yeah, I won't be around.
It happened in USFL, right? Didn't in USFL?
Yes, they had a giant debacle where everybody saw the entire ownership at lock. Oops. And then it turned out it changed very little, which I think is what I also read, that even after this was revealed and people could swap, like that final ownership was pretty similar to the original ownership. People didn't make many changes, I guess.
But how many more conspiracy? Like, I know they're doing this because the dumb casual people don't want zeros in their lineup. The 2 times a year this may happen, and I get cater. Yes, okay. I don't want that either. I get it.
Yeah,
but it's as likely to happen to me as it is to anyone else, and we're long-term thinkers, whatever. But how many more situations are there going to be where people complain that maybe they, how many that it's rigged, bots? What this lineup wasn't anywhere near this, and then this happened, and this. You mentioned the collusion part, right? What happens if let me just figure out. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Papa Gates plays MMA. I know Chipotle does every so often, but imagine the first time that Papa Gates and Chipotle are 1-2 with one fighter off and win first place, and then everything goes off of, oh, they obviously have 300 lineups and they're doing this. Like even if they're not doing it, there'll be so many more complaints on that.
I've had people accuse me of such things in other sports. Imagine it's going to be times 1,000 for MMA because
how do they what do they accuse you of?
People think everyone's colluding against them.
Or that you're running all this stuff in the air and 5 other sharp players are playing with you and right.
So I mean,
another question, that I forgot to ask is that I know you're big into you don't like doing the late swap because you can't back test it.
That's one of the reasons.
How would you back test? Would you try back testing this by taking a snapshot at every time you late swap, and then back test I know it's this feels like a problem that you would do and hope that it's correct and not be able to really tell by going back let me replay these 30 slates and let me make every different late swap decision and see which ways that it would have came out. To me, I almost feel like that's almost a harder problem to solve.
It is. And I honestly, I think I wouldn't do it at all because it would be both more difficult and significantly less precise than what I do now. So I probably wouldn't even bother. I think because you can't back test it in the same way because your opponents would, especially in a small field, so imagine you want to back test your swaps, right? In a 10-man. Say, well, what would have happened if I made a different swap? What would my EV have been? And then you can't do that because your opponents would likely make different choices based on what your choices were. So you can't make any assumptions that your opponents would just do exactly what they did. That doesn't make any sense. So, and because that aspect is so critical, is going to be so critical, especially in smaller field, I don't see how you do it. I think Yeah, I have other things I would probably look at, but I don't think literal back testing of the whole process would be even possible for that reason.
I think there's a way to back test this. I'm just giving you a preview of what I'm going to attempt to do. For the small field stuff, because I'm focusing more on the small field stuff. I want to see if I could come up with predictive metrics for a user's likelihood of swapping.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be taking basically the 555 or the $100 single entry or whatever. I'm going to take a contest. I'm going to download the CSV. I'm going to do this for the next, 10, 20. I mean, keep putting the data set together. And then based on like what they obviously play, like there are certain users that I know play a certain way. And I go, what did this lineup look like at the end? Because I don't know what it looked like at the beginning. But like what did it look like at the end? And in comparison to previous slates, like I know a lot, like for instance, there are plenty of people that in the $100 single entry just throw in their cash lineup.
Sure. Yep, I know some of these people too.
If I see at the end that their lineup looks nothing like a cash lineup, I know that they're swapping, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's
I want to be able to tell, because to me the biggest edge, like for instance, let's use the extreme example, Daniel. If I'm playing the 555, 300 entries, I have one entry. Doesn't matter how many entries. If I knew for sure that all 299 of my other entries would never swap, and I have the ability to late swap, that's a humongous edge.
Yes.
Right. So knowing if I knew that only 10% of my opponents were late swapping, and I'm always late swapping, I still have a much bigger. If I knew that everyone was late swapping, my ability to late swap isn't as big of an edge, because now I have to predict what other people are going to do when they swap. But if I knew based on the usernames who's more likely to swap, who's more likely to pay attention, it's not even like what they're going to do. Like I'm not even trying to measure what they're going to do. I'm just trying to measure if they're even going to pay attention to do anything. So then I can make better decisions later in a card and go, well, based on my past data, user A, user B, user C, which I'm competing with, A and B, I have their awareness percentage at like 7%, meaning that most likely whatever lineup is there at lock, that's what they have.
That's it. Yep.
And they're more likely to spend most of their salary. So it's like now I can better predict their lineup, even with like 2 fighters left in their lineup, because it's like, well, that's probably going to be close to 50K, and it's also probably going to be leveraged for this contest because they're a decent player, that they're not playing like 2 big dogs together or something like that. And then there's this other players, like in user C, I have their awareness metric at like 90%. So it's like, this is the type of person where they're going to be looking at what I'm doing also. Like, so now I have to think, like, they're going to see that I'm swapping here and there. So they're going to try to jump me. But these 2 people over here, I could just basically fill out their lineups right now and go, well, that's what they're playing and whatever. Like we mentioned before, in large field contests, imagine trying to do that.
Right.
And the difference is, oh, well, I do 5 here and 7 there. You're not jumping that many places. But in a 555, where knowing that 2 of my opponents that have X and Y left, and I'm sitting in 17th place and they're sitting in 9th and 10th, and I'm like, because I know this, I have a much better shot at getting 8th place, maybe not first. Like that could be the difference of like $200 and $1,250 or $1,500.
Well,
and
yeah,
I would like to know that.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on what I would actually try to do in terms of backtesting. What I would look at specifically is I would look at the sequence of, okay, here's what the field looked like after the first fight. Basically have the CSV for each step. And then I would try and figure out for each player, how often do I think they made correct swap or non-swap decisions.
Right.
based on my own methodology. Like, how many players do I believe are making sharp moves and how many are not? Like that I could backtest. Of course that assumes my own stuff is actually good, which would probably take some doing. But I think it's much easier to have intuition about the small field. I think it's still early, so I don't pretend to have any of this figured out yet, but I think it's much trickier in large field to really figure out what's going on, because it's just such a messy problem.
But people will solve it.
Yeah, I think we'll figure it out.
Right. Right. Lastly, the question really comes into how many people will try to figure it out. Yeah. How many people will successfully execute it so they can? And then how many people that aren't doing that decide not to play because they see that other people are doing so.
Right. Yeah. And I think, having lots more strategic decisions to make always helps you, even if it's messy. Like, even if you're not confident that all of your decisions are good, the more of them you have, the more, like let's say I think 60% of the time I'm making plus EV decisions in my swaps and 40% I'm not. Well, if you have a whole bunch of late swap opportunities, it's much more plus EV for you, because each time you do it, you're 60-40 to improve your EV or whatever. I'm just making up numbers.
Right.
And in MMA, you're going to have a lot of options to make these kind of decisions. So even if you're only directionally accurate, or even if some of your decisions are wrong, as long as enough of them are right, it's still going to be an edge. Like, you're not going to have to be perfect at this for it to be worth trying to figure out. So I think if you're like a player like you who's highly DK savvy, fantasy savvy, but not running sims, I think there's probably a lot of room to get a lot of edge, even if you're not trying to do stuff the way that I'm trying to do it.
Right. And we'll discuss more, like on I do MMAs on this show on Fridays, and maybe there'll be situations where, like, oh, this chalky guy is in the second fight, so let's talk about what do you do if you faded or not. Like, there'll be more discussions like that on the MMA Ground and Bound podcast here on for premium members. But Daniel, people could find you on Twitter to set up collusion partnerships with you.
Yeah. No one's ever approached me for that, but yeah,
right.
For what it's worth, no one's ever asked me to do anything shady for them, so I think that's a good sign. Yep, I'm there.
Thanks for coming on and talking about it.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I think it's really interesting. I'm a little bummed I won't get to play as much, but I will eagerly await the post-mortem after this weekend. Really curious to see what happens.
Right, because one slate sample size will mean that's what it is for everything.
Exactly, right. Yeah, we know everything. Yep.
Okay, so give me those thumbs on your way out the door. Hit the thumbs up button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. We'll post this in the MMA section on the RotoGrinders website. We'll label it, like MMA, late swap, something, whatever. So it's like pinned. So even 3 months from now, you could kind of see, like, oh, I haven't played late swap MMA. What does it matter so much? Well, this is why it matters. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. We'll go over some World Cup soccer stuff tomorrow. That's coming up. And follow Daniel. Daniel's probably going to be in the chat tomorrow anyway. Listening to me answer your DFS strategy questions like I always do, like I try to do here on the DFS Pre-Game Show on RotoGrinders.com.